Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at one fantasy football sleeper for every NFL team. I thought this was a pretty fun idea considering the season is starting up soon, which means your fantasy football season is probably also starting soon and you probably haven't drafted yet. So this is good obviously before you end up drafting. And obviously with most of my content being basketball and football, it's still the off season for both, so it's harder to really find stuff to make content for. Really quick while you're looking at what's on the screen, don't look at Jack Smith and Jigba for too long because I don't know what's wrong with his mouth. That's not what the actual picture looks like. I don't know what happened. Okay, I don't know what happened, but yeah, I'm not a pro level editor. Just letting you know right now. Just hoping that my football knowledge kind of overrules that. But let's get started. Really quick before we kind of get started, I want to say, like I said, this is sleepers. So for teams, even it's going to be kind of hard to find some for some of the teams. They're really, really too good. Obviously, you already know all their offensive options. They don't really have a sleeper, but I would say for their average draft position, do I think they're getting drafted way lower than they should is kind of what I would go with at that point. And this is kind of be, based off how much they're rosterized in leagues, stuff like that. I also want to say we're not going to talk too much about some of these guys just because I don't want to have a video that's over an hour long because that's how long it could be if I really, really got in detail with a lot of these guys. But yeah, like a lot of fantasy football is going to be based off, I think, just reps and, how much they're getting carries. If a, receiver is getting a lot of the targets, he's likely going to be a good fantasy player regardless of if he is actually as talented as some other receivers in the league. Or, with running backs, if they're getting a lot of carries, they're going to usually be good in fantasy. So that's kind of how I targeted some of the guys that we kind of go over in this. But we're starting off with Trey McBride for the Arizona Cardinals. Obviously, a lot of people talking about Marvin Harrison, but Trey McBride's been good for the last few years. He's literally been probably one of their top, receiving targets, and he gets a lot of receptions. He also didn't even play with Kyler Murray too much last year, considering Kyler Murray was out for a bit. And Marvin Harrison, like I said, he's the one a lot of people are talking about, and rightfully so. He's going to be amazing. But this is going to be, I think, the second option after him in terms of the receiving game. And I think it definitely makes a lot of sense to go out and try to get Trey McBride. Possibly pretty late. I think he's like 85% rosterized in leagues currently as of when this is being made. Obviously, a lot could change by the time the season starts. But I think for his rosterization, if that's even a word, he's pretty good. And I think he'll play better than a lot of the tight ends that are going over him in a lot of fantasy drafts. So, that's who I have for the Arizona Cardinals. Next up, we have Darnell Mooney he is going to them, but we also have him for the Atlanta Falcons for their sleeper. Playing for the Bears, obviously they have been a terrible receiving team historically. And now he's going to a team where he's going to, they got Kirk Cousins. They have obviously new coaching. And a lot of people are talking about a lot of their other options because of that. Kyle Pitts, maybe this is finally his year. Drake London, Bijan Robinson, a lot of their top options a lot of people are talking about. But not many people are talking about Darnell Mooney, who, I think he's like 60% rosterized in a lot of leagues. And, he's going to be the receiver too on this team. Pairing him up with Kirk Cousins, there's a good chance that he has a really, really good year with the Falcons. And that's why I have him for the sleeper for the Falcons. Next up, we have Zay Flowers. It's not an out there, kind of take with this one, but it's hard to really find who would be a sleeper on this team. But I do think Zay Flowers is essentially kind of a sleeper in terms of I think he will play better than a lot of receivers that are drafted ahead of him. He's going to benefit a lot from Derrick Henry coming to this team. The run game of Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry is going to be really, really hard to stop. And I feel like from that, they're going to stack the box. They're going to try to prevent the run so much sometimes. That is going to help Zay Flowers have a lot more space. Or, if they're running like an RPO and they really heavily run commit, it's going to give Zay Flowers a lot of time to really, or a lot of space to really, work with that he didn't have before. And they're not as, focused on Zay Flowers now with Derrick Henry. We saw it a lot last year where he catches screen passes. He kind of, would be the guy getting the ball in those RPO situations because he is good after the catch. And so I think with the run game of Derrick Henry, it's going to, add another level of this offense of where they're going to have to focus a lot on the running game of Lamar Jackson, Derrick Henry. And I think Zay Flowers is going to benefit from it a lot. Also, just adding in the fact that he's going from a rookie to a sophomore, I think there's going to be development just in that alone. And so I think Zay Flowers is going to have a really, really good year. That's why I have him as the sleeper for the Baltimore Ravens. Next up, we have Keon Coleman for the Buffalo Bills. And it was between him and Khalil Shakir. As, Khalil Shakir also could have a really good year. And a lot of people are not talking about. He's also really, really low, rosterized. Keon Coleman, on the other hand, he's their highest rosterized receiver in fantasy. But I think he could be, in terms of wide receiver ones in fantasy, he probably is one of the lowest drafted in average draft position for wide receiver ones. And it's hard to imagine a team with Josh Allen at QB is not going to hit his receiver number one, and he's going to have a really, really good year. So, yeah, Keon Coleman, so far in training camp, he has been the receiver number one. And I think because of that, it's just you're going to see it. Like I said, a lot of fantasy football is going to be based off, if someone's getting targeted a lot, they're likely going to do good. I think that's going to happen a lot here with Keon Coleman. Obviously, they don't have Gabe Davis or Stephon Diggs anymore, so they got to find someone to replace them. Keon Coleman here coming in. I think he's going to have a really, really good year. And like I said, out of all the wide receiver ones, he's probably one of the lowest drafted wide receiver ones in all of fantasy. Next up, we have Xavier Legette, another rookie receiver. And with this one, I kind of just there's a lot of options you could really pick for a sleeper on this team, but I think Xavier Legette kind of reminds me a lot of DK Metcalf, just based off his build, how he is as a receiver. We saw DK his rookie year, literally he fell kind of in the draft, and then he had an amazing rookie year. I think we could see the same with Xavier Legette. Obviously, the receiving options ahead of him. They just got Deontay Johnson, who a lot of people are obviously talking about for who they would get on this team at receiver in fantasy. Then Adam Thielen, who had a really good year last year, but he is still obviously getting older. And Bryce Young's in his second year. Hopefully, we could see Xavier Legette get some PT at receiver, get some reps. And I think he'll actually have a really good rookie year. So that's kind of my sleeper for the Carolina Panthers. Next up, we have Cole Kmet for the Chicago Bears. And obviously, this receiving core is really, really good. And in terms of actual football standpoint, that's really good. In fantasy, it is not really good if you have one of the receivers. I wouldn't go after the Bears receivers for the simple fact of I don't know who's going to really be the wide receiver one on this team. Because, DJ Moore obviously has not played with Rome Odunze or Keenan Allen. They're all going to be a new receiving core. So we don't really know who's going to be the favorite for Caleb Williams. It's a really new offense. Literally all their weapons have not played with each other. And so, we got to really figure out who's going to be the main guys getting the ball at receivers. So that's why I'm not going after any of them. But I'm kind of going with the saying of a rookie QB's favorite, our best friend is a tight end. And Cole Kmet has been really good for the last few years. I think he's going to get a lot of receptions still. I think he's a pretty good sleeper on this team. It's kind of between him and DeAndre Swift. Because DeAndre Swift has had a really good year last year, and I think he will again this year. But I don't know how much he really benefited from that Eagles O-line, so I'm not too sure if he'll have the same season or not. So that's why I'm going with Cole Kmet. Next up for the Bengals, as you can see, we have running back 1 for this team. Right now, we don't really know who that is. It's between Chase Brown and Zach Moss. Chase Brown currently I would give the edge to, as he's been taking a lot of the first team reps in training camp. But they moved on from Joe Mixon. Obviously, with that being said, they have to be confident in, the running backs that they, either Zach Moss, who they got in free agency, or Chase Brown, who had a pretty good year last year as a backup running back. And they have to have some type of confidence if they're willing to move on from him. And I think having any running back one in fantasy football is going to be something that you want to have. And especially for some of the guys that go later on, I would target a lot of the running back ones for, my bench, obviously, instead of, someone that's kind of splitting carries. So I think whoever wins the running back one job for this team is someone that you should definitely target as the sleeper for the Bengals. Next up, we have Jerry Jeudy for the Cleveland Browns. And this is simply kind of just like a buy for a player that is, going to a new situation. The rest of the team for them kind of looks the same, and we kind of know what they are. Like, we already know what David Njoku is. We already know what Amari Cooper is. We already know what Deshaun Watson is. Jerome Ford, how long is he going to be the starter for before Nick Chubb comes back? We don't know. So I'm simply going with Jerry Jeudy, who's, change of scenery. I think obviously it's a better situation than the Broncos. Could benefit him, and that's why I have him for the sleeper for the Browns, not the Bengals, the Browns. Next up, we have Ezekiel Elliott for the Dallas Cowboys, and it was another team where it's kind of hard to pick one. So I think he could be washed. He could be washed, right? But for where he's, probably going to get drafted in your league, depending on how many people are in your league, or if he even gets drafted at all, he's going to be still a running back one on a team that's, last year was great on offense. I expect them again to have a really good offense, meaning that he likely will get some touchdowns if they get, towards the end zone. And yeah, I mean, he played for a really bad Patriots team last year. I wouldn't put so much into it. Like I said, yeah, he definitely could be washed, but I think the upside in getting Ezekiel Elliott late on in a fantasy draft could be something that you definitely could benefit a lot from. So that's why I have Ezekiel Elliott for the Dallas Cowboys. Next up for the Denver Broncos, we got Greg Dulcich, who last year played 2 games and, missed the rest of the season with injury. And I feel like that is a big reason why people kind of forgot what he was the year before, as he was pretty good, especially for, I'm pretty sure he's, under like 5 or 6% rosterized in fantasy. And I think this is a tight end that even if you don't draft, you maybe look in the waiver wire, and he's someone that, you let a week or two go by of the season. He's playing good, you go pick him up. Obviously this team's not going to have many options this year. And kind of like I was saying with Caleb Williams and Cole Kmet, a rookie quarterback's best friend is a tight end. So Bo Nix obviously looks like he will be the starter. And you could see him going to Greg Dulcich a lot this season. And, with their top options kind of being Courtland Sutton, and after that, not much else in the receiving game, he looks like he will get a lot of, receptions. Who I had kind of this in him between was Javonte Williams. I think Javonte Williams also could have a pretty big year, get a lot of carries, because the offense looks obviously not that good. But, yeah, I'm going with Greg Dulcich here. Next up for the Detroit Lions, we have Jameson Williams. We don't have to talk about this one too much, aside from he hasn't really played a full season, whether it's injury, suspension. He just has not been able to play a full season, and now he's going to be the receiver 2 for this team with Josh Reynolds leaving. And the rest of their options, we already know kind of who they are. Jahmyr Gibbs could have a really, really good year, but he obviously is still going to have to deal with splitting carries and splitting kind of snaps with, David Montgomery, who's still really good. So I think Jameson Williams is someone that is a pretty good sleeper that you can go and probably get late on in a draft, or sometimes, he might even not be on a roster after the draft. and you look to get him after the draft. So that's who I have for the Lions. Next up, we have for the Packers, Dontavion Wicks. A little bit more of an out there pick, I would say, but someone that is really, really low rosterized. And this is kind of buying on a guy that I think could have a really, really good year. But it's kind of a high risk, high reward. Or kind of a low risk, high reward pick, I would say, actually. With him having a really, really good year last year as a rookie. And I feel like a lot of people didn't really see it too much or talk about it just because Jaden Reed, who also was a rookie, had a really good year. And they have, obviously, a really good receiving core where he looks like he could be the receiver number 4. But he could also edge out the job over, like, Romeo Doubs or something like that. And I think he could have a really, really good year as a sophomore season. So Dontavion Wicks is who I have for the Green Bay Packers. Next up, we have Tank Dell for the Houston Texans. And I don't really like anyone on this team, but we kind of had to pick someone. And when I say I don't like them, I really like Tank Dell. I really like a lot of their players. But in terms of fantasy, their offense looks so good that it is going to be kind of like I said with the Bears. It is hard to see who's going to really get the ball that much. They added Stephon Diggs and Joe Mixon. I don't know how much that's going to affect, Nico Collins and Tank Dell, who had, Tank Dell really good rookie year last year. Nico Collins had a lot of receptions last year. But when you add more weapons to the offense, you have to spread the ball out a little bit more. I don't know how much he'll get the ball, but Tank Dell had a really good, rookie year, and I think he will be even better this year. It's really going to just come down to, how much he actually gets the ball because they have so many weapons on offense. And so that's what it really comes down to. But if I had to pick someone on this team, it would be Tank Dell as the sleeper on their offense. Next up, we have Anthony Richardson with the Colts here. And he's probably one of my favorite quarterbacks, if not my favorite quarterback in fantasy this year. It's really just the rushing ability gives you so many fantasy points. And he had 4 rushing touchdowns in 2 games last season. I think he's going to play, obviously, hopefully a full season this year. And if so, he could be a top 5 fantasy player at the quarterback position simply just from the running game alone. Obviously, I don't think he's a better quarterback than some other quarterbacks or a top 5 quarterback in the NFL. But in terms of fantasy, he could definitely be a top 5 quarterback. That's why I'm picking him for the Colts. Next up, we have Gabe Davis for the Jacksonville Jaguars. And I was kind of surprised when I was looking around and I seen that he's like rosterized in 25% of leagues. For some reason, I'm not really too sure. They just lost Zay Jones and Calvin Ridley, and they replaced it with Gabe Davis and Brian Thomas. And they paid Gabe Davis a pretty good amount of money, and I think just off that alone, you're not going to see them not play him. And I think he's going to have a really, really good year with Trevor Lawrence at QB. Obviously, he didn't have the greatest year last year with the Bills, but he still had a pretty decent season. And I feel like for a guy that is only in 1 out of every 4 leagues, it's kind of crazy to kind of think about that with Gabe Davis because he has been a pretty good receiver for the last few years. So I'm kind of surprised, and I think he's a pretty big sleeper you can go after for the Jacksonville Jaguars. Next up, we have Xavier Worthy for the Kansas City Chiefs, and it would have been Rashee Rice for the Chiefs, but because he has the suspension or likely will get a suspension, I didn't pick Rashee Rice, and I think it also is going to benefit Xavier Worthy a lot. Rashee Rice, if he's out for the first however many weeks, Xavier Worthy obviously going to move up the depth chart and get more of the targets. I think he's going to have, obviously a really good year. It's kind of insane to think about his speed playing with Patrick Mahomes as a deep threat. It's a perfect pairing, okay? It just might give you flashes of Tyreek Hill back on the Chiefs. But yeah, so that's why I would have Xavier Worthy as the sleeper for the Chiefs. Next up, we have for the Raiders, Zamir White, who likely will be the running back 1 as they lost Josh Jacobs. And he could be, I think, really, really good on this offense. They brought in Gardner Minshew. He likes to pass the ball a lot, though. That is the only downside I would say about this. But I think any running back one in fantasy is always a good option. Tight end, it's kind of hard to make out because they have, obviously, Michael Meyer, and then they have Brock Bowers. So I don't know who's really going to get the ball more between them or more of the snaps there. And then at receiver, we kind of already know what the receivers are. So I think Zamir White could actually be a really, really good pickup. And you never know. This guy could have an insane season. You see it all the time. Some guy that is drafted pretty late, they have a really, really insane season once they actually take over a running back one job. It's usually the running backs that, like I said, if they're the number one running back, they're going to usually be pretty good in fantasy. Next up, we have Cooper Kupp for the LA Rams. It's kind of hard to choose one for this team, so we are going with Cooper Kupp. It is kind of crazy to say Cooper Kupp would be a sleeper. But if you look at this team, I mean, like I said, at this point, when you're this good of a player, I would just say the only reason I would call him a sleeper is because the people he could get drafted under, I could definitely see him playing better than. Literally a few years ago, he was by far one of the most insane receivers and had one of the best receiving years we've ever seen. If he could stay healthy, maybe we see it again. Matthew Stafford passes the ball a lot. It's usually the top two receivers that get like 9 receptions each, literally every time. So Cooper Kupp still will be obviously really good in fantasy, and I think I just have him as, the sleeper because it's really hard to pick anyone else on this team as a sleeper, and so that's why we have Cooper Kupp. Next up, we have Ladd McConkey, who is for the LA Chargers. Ladd McConkey will be the receiver one. It's so far as we know from training camp, and I think this is another guy that, like I said, with Keon Coleman, who's another rookie receiver, you're pairing him with a really good quarterback, and he's a receiver one. He's one of the, bottom ranked wide receiver ones in terms of draft position. Him and Keon Coleman literally are not getting drafted that high, and they're both going to be receiver ones for playing with good quarterbacks. It's just pairings that you kind of like. You got to give – he's going to throw the ball to someone, okay? Someone has to get the ball on this team. Ladd McConkey will be that guy for this team as we, kind of see so far. Like I said, he is the receiver number one. But, yeah, that's why I have him for the Chargers. Next up, we have for the Dolphins, Tua Tagovailoa. And this is simply just based off where he's, rosterized. Obviously, we already know the receiving core. A-Chain and Raheem Mostert, I don't really like going after one of them just simply because they're kind of splitting the carries in the backfield. Obviously, they're both really good, but I just like a running back that obviously is going to touch the ball a lot more. But, yeah, I mean, Tua is rosterized in 60% of leagues, and it's kind of hard to think about that when he has the offense that he has around him. He's definitely, I think, going to be good, and, you likely always will see, if you have a good receiver, good offense, the quarterback's also likely going to have a really good stat line and good, fantasy points. So that's why I have Tua for the Dolphins. Next up, I have TJ Hawkinson for the Minnesota Vikings. And there's definitely some options I could have went with, maybe their running back Chandler. But TJ Hawkinson is getting drafted still obviously pretty late because he could miss the beginning of the season. And I feel like this is a guy that you could definitely go after. And, you keep him on the bench for a few weeks, and once he comes back, he could literally be a top tight end in the league. And so I think if you're waiting on a tight end for a while in your fantasy draft, this is a guy you maybe get pretty late that you could at least just, have him on the bench for a few weeks if he is out for a few weeks. And then by the time he's back, you move him into your starting tight end spot. And now you have one of the top tight ends in the league because TJ Hawkinson is an amazing tight end. And again, it kind of goes with our pairing of, rookie quarterbacks. Favorite, their best friend is a tight end. It's just going more with the pairing even more so. J.J. McCarthy being the starter, so that's why I have him for the Vikings. Next up, we have Demario Douglas for the Patriots. I expect him to make a jump. Last year, he literally looked like one of the only positive sides of the offense, which there really wasn't any. But he at least had, some potential for that offense. And I can see him taking a bigger jump this year, especially with now they don't have to deal with Mac Jones at QB anymore. They got, Drake May. So Demario Douglas is who I have for the Patriots. I just think in terms of their whole offense, he could be their top weapon next season. And I do really expect that. Next up, we have Rashid Rice. Or I said Rashid Rice. Oh, my God. Rashid Shaheed. We have Rashid Shaheed for the New Orleans Saints. So, this is simply just based off, again, where someone's playing in terms of play time. It's hard to pick anyone else on this team. And for their wide receiver, too, Rashid Shaheed is going to be the wide receiver, too. He had a really good year last year. You also could get some fantasy points from him in the return game if he does get a touchdown. And this is definitely a guy that was a really good returner last year. You never know what happens. I know they changed the kickoff rules, so I don't know how that's going to affect if more touchdowns are scored off of kickoffs. But if they are, you never know. That could also help you a lot, getting some fantasy points that way. But I think Rashid Shaheed is the biggest sleeper on the Saints in fantasy football. Next up, for the Giants, we have Wan'Dale Robinson. Similar to what I said about Demario Douglas, he was really the only bright spot of the offense, if there really was any bright spot for their offense last year, as he did get a lot of receptions, and he looked like one of the only good weapons in the receiving game. Now this year, they obviously are going to have Daniel Jones back from injury. Don't know how much of an improvement that is. He isn't the greatest quarterback, but they also have Malik Neighbors, who they got in the draft, and I think that could also add some more pressure off of Wan'Dale Robinson. And I think he could be a little sneaky good wide receiver too in the NFL this year for the Giants. So that's why I have him for the Giants for their sleeper. Next up, I have Mike Williams for the Jets, and this is one that definitely could be really interesting. He could miss time, obviously, coming off a torn ACL. I don't know when he will return. But when he does, this guy is someone that he's rosterized, I think, in like 79% of leagues. Even if you go pick him late in the draft, this is someone that later on, playing with Aaron Rodgers, he's going to get the ball. He's going to be a touchdown threat. And someone that will get the ball a lot when he is back from injury. And I really, really do want to see what he's going to play like with Aaron Rodgers. And I think he's one of my favorite sleepers out of everyone in this whole entire list, simply just because of the potential of him playing with Aaron Rodgers. Next up, we have Dallas Goedert for the Eagles. And, their offense is just, we already know how their offense is. I was thinking about him or Saquon Barkley just because Saquon Barkley is going to be amazing, but everyone already knows that. So that's why he's not really a sleeper. But if I had to pick a sleeper, it would be Dallas Goedert, just simply because, he's the lowest rosterized guy on their offense, and I think he is really, really good. I think he could play better than a lot of tight ends that he does end up getting drafted under. So that's why I got Dallas Goedert for the Eagles. Next up, we have Pat Freiermuth for the Steelers. Last year, he had a down year compared to, what he was playing like before that. But I think now he's going to be one of the top options on this team. They lost Deontay Johnson. He should get more of the targets on this team. And now they don't have Kenny Pickett. So I don't know who's going to have the quarterback one position. I don't know if it's going to be, Justin Fields or Russell Wilson. We don't know yet. But overall, whoever it is, I think he's going to be a big option on offense because they don't have much else except for George Pickens. So, Pat Frymuth, I think, could be another really, really good tight end position to add late in the fantasy draft. And he's another one of the guys that is one of my favorites out of all the people I have on this list. Next up, we have Ricky Pearsall, rookie receiver with the San Francisco 49ers. And to me, this is simply just betting on a guy that could possibly get a lot more, targets if Brandon Ayuk does end up leaving the team. Right now, it looks like Brandon Ayuk will stay with the 49ers. But if he does, for whatever reason, leave, this could be someone that is going to take the wide receiver 2 spot and play really, really well in that position. It's hard to pick anyone else on this team. But for him, I think, like I said, if Brandon Ayuk does leave, there's a really good chance this guy takes over a lot. And I think he still could be really good even if Brandon Ayuk does stay on the team. So that's who I have for the 49ers. Next up, for the Seahawks, this is my favorite sleeper. Maybe a little bit biased because I am a Seahawks fan. But Jaxon Smith-Njigba, last year, he had honestly a really good rookie year. And as the season went on, it looked a lot better, even more so towards the end of the season. And with Tyler Lockett getting a little bit older, I definitely see him taking a step back maybe in the offense and them kind of pivoting to more of the younger players like Jaxon Smith-Njigba. And I expect him to have a really, really big year this season. He's playing with a lot of options around him, obviously, but I think overall he still is going to have a really, really good year with DK Metcalf around him, Kenneth Walker. They have a lot of guys. And another player I would say that it was between with this team is Noah Fant, who literally is on like 1% of fantasy teams for some reason, even though every year for like the last 3 or 4 years he's been like tight end number 15 by the time the season ends. So, I mean, that's who I would have aside from Jaxon Smith-Njigba, but I think he's going to have a really big year next year for the Seahawks. Next up, we have Baker Mayfield for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and it's hard for their other options, and he's like 60% rosterized. I think Baker Mayfield could definitely be as good as what he was last year. He just got the bag. Hopefully he could live up to that contract. And if he does play how he did last year, then he's going to be someone that you could definitely get as a steal based off, like I said, how much he is, rosterized right now and where he is getting drafted in leagues. It was between him and Trey Palmer. Just because the receivers are getting older, Trey Palmer, I think, could be someone that maybe breaks out this year and kind of takes over more of the load on offense for the receiving game. But I'm still going Baker Mayfield here for the Buccaneers. Next up, we have DeAndre Hopkins for the Titans, and this is simply just a buy low on a guy that, we already know what he's been in his whole career. Obviously, this season, or this last season, he wasn't that good, but that's why I would go out and get him as a sleeper or a buy low, I would say, just based off how the rest of their offense looks. I don't know if I like going after either of the running backs with Tony Pollard or Tyjae Spears, just because I don't know who's really going to win out the job. I don't know how that's going to look. Are they going to split carries? I don't know how it's going to look. But I definitely could say D-Hop, if he does return to what he was, this is going to be someone that you definitely won't regret getting a little bit later on in the draft. So simply just a buy low. Next up and last, we have Austin Eckler, which just like D-Hop, is another guy that's a buy low. Hard to forget that last year, this was literally someone that people took literally like top 10 in every draft. Top 10 guy in a fantasy draft. And now someone that is going to be a lot later of a pick, but he still will probably be, running back one, or at least have a lot of the carries on this team with Brian Robinson. But another guy that's a buy low. If he does return to the form that he was, in years past, obviously it looks like he was a lot slower. He's dealing with injuries. But if he does return to what he was before that, this is going to be someone you definitely don't regret going after and getting in a really late round in a fantasy draft. So those are all the guys I have for each team for a sleeper or someone that I would say go out and get that's not, the top guys on the team. Just a little fun idea. Just, kind of quick something I made. But yeah, so I hope y'all enjoyed. Y'all let me know some of the guys that you're going to go after in fantasy, your favorite sleepers in fantasy football. And that's it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next one.